Presented by the Common Sense Institute, welcome to Common Sense Digest, the podcast that seeks to inject a little common sense into Arizona's policy discussion. Here's your host, Earl Wright.
Welcome to the Common Sense Digest podcast. My name is Earl Wright, and I am the chairman of the board of Common Sense Institute and your host today. In this episode, we're diving into Common Sense Institute's report, Arizona's Urban Desert Miracle, which examines how the state has transformed its desert landscape into a thriving economic hub, despite challenges like the 20-year drought we currently have and overallocated water resources. Arizona has leveraged engineering ingenuity, infrastructure investment, and market-based solutions to sustain growth. The report highlights the urban areas, particularly in Maricopa County, and water use efficiency, and the contributive nature of the programs they have for the state's economy. By rethinking water as a valuable resource and embracing new technologies, Arizona is proving that with the right strategies, desert growth isn't just possible, it's a model for the future and the continual growth of their economy in that part of the United States. Let's get started with the big question. How does a desert become one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the United States? Glenn, give us some insight if you would.
Well, thank you, Earl. And I love the question and I love the framing that you offered ahead of that question, because the short answer is, at least historically, it doesn't. You know, there's an image we included in the report fairly early on that to me is striking, and anyone can draw the conclusion just by looking at it. It's a nighttime satellite image of the United States, and you see a clear vertical line that splits the country basically in two. On the east side of that line, there's a ton of lights, which tells me there's a ton of development. On the west side of that line, it's relatively dark, which tells me there's not a lot of development. That line also coincides, not coincidentally, with the dry side and the wet side of the United States. East of that line, the United States is relatively wet. There's a lot of water and a lot of rainfall. West of that line, the United States is relatively dry. There's not nearly as much fresh water, and there's far, far less rainfall. So traditionally, historically, development has occurred where water is available and it's easy to get to. Those are places that have freshwater rivers, rain, stuff like that. It hasn't occurred in places like Arizona, and especially not in places like the Phoenix Metro, which is in the middle of the desert and gets basically no water. So going back to your question, how and why then has that changed? What's enabled it to occur more recently? The short answer to that is development, infrastructure, and engineering. We've used a combination of natural systems, those are rivers and gravity, and man-made systems, canals and electric pumps, to move water from places that are relatively rich in it, like the Rocky Mountains in the southern part of your state, to our central desert valley. And that movement of the water has enabled the rapid growth. And we can then leverage what the Phoenix metro area does have, which is a moderate climate, a lot of flat, open, buildable land, stuff like that, and make up for what it doesn't have, which is fresh water.
You've mentioned how you've handled the growth and the sourcing of water. Give us a little bit more, if you could, please, in talking about the Colorado River and how you all have used that, and now apparently that it's as a resource, it's not as available as has been in the past. In fact, it's been a disappointing resource. But yet you built infrastructure in the 20th century that has sustained things, and you've also come up in your study and said, hey, we also have right here in Arizona resources that maybe we can think more positively about or more creatively about. Tie all this together for me, would you please?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So there's really three primary water systems that have fueled growth and development in the Phoenix metro area and in the Central Valley of Arizona. There's the Colorado River, which you talked about, and that's sort of the most famous recently because, as you alluded to in your introduction, the drought and the oversubscription of Colorado River resources has combined to create a crisis where there's just not enough water in the river anymore to go around. But there are two other systems, and they haven't been talked about, certainly nationally, but even locally nearly as much. And I think the reason for that is they're just not in crisis. The other systems are the Salt River and the canal systems that feed off that. Those predate Central Arizona Project and the Colorado River canal systems, and those reservoirs are relatively full despite the drought. We also have groundwater. That's the other big source. And the groundwater system, as far as I can tell, looking at well depth data, also has been relatively resilient in the drought. So ironically, the only system that we're sort of familiar with and the system we spend the most time talking about is the one of the three systems that's sort of struggling the most with the drought, and that's the Colorado River system. So then the question becomes, why is Colorado River water specifically suffering? And I think the answer there is it's simply overallocated. We overpromised a century ago the users of Colorado River water, and we've attempted to meet those promises despite the drought, instead of doing what we've done historically, which is identify new sources and build new infrastructure to fuel the growth. We really haven't added to Arizona's canal or water infrastructure systems since we completed the Central Arizona Project for the Colorado River water delivery in the 90s.
Your study, which I thank you so much for doing, it highlights the economics associated with the current allocation of water and how it's used, and also the benefits of having more water. The striking statistic that I just want to bring up for you to discuss is every acre foot of water in Maricopa County contributes over $110,000 to regional GDP. That's huge. And is there a cause effect there that more water you have, the more GDP you can have?
I think that's a fair and not unreasonable conclusion, and goes back to my answer to your first question, right? We clearly see a lot of development where there is a lot of easy access to water, not so much where there isn't. So yes, I think there is some cause and effect, but there's really two pieces to that ratio that's important. One is, there's a lot of GDP, obviously, in Maricopa County and the Phoenix metro area, but there's also not a lot of water use in Maricopa County and the Phoenix metro area. And the reason is the economy has shifted in the valley from primarily agriculture 100 years ago to primarily residential, light commercial, and increasingly high-tech manufacturing more recently. These industries use a lot less water on average to produce their GDP than do agricultural uses. So we often think about suburban development, new housing or semiconductor manufacturing or data centers is like this scary thing that's going to come in and use all this water. And it's true, all of these things demand water to produce, to exist. You can't have a house without water, obviously, but compared to the traditional uses of most of our water in Arizona, United States, agriculture, they use a lot less. And so that transition actually may not be as demanding on our water sources as it seems at first.
Hold on. What is the usage of, let's say, urban Arizona compared to the usage of your total water for the agricultural community in Arizona? Just so we have a perspective.
It's a great question, and it's in the report. I'm going to go from memory, so I could be wrong on the exact details, but it's easily something in the order of 2/3 of water use in Arizona goes to agricultural purposes, and about 1/3 goes to all other, with the largest share of all other being the residential. Your industrial uses, your commercial uses, smaller from there. On the other hand, you can flip that, more than flip that, when you're looking at the economic output of the state. Roughly 80% of the economic output of the state comes from our 1/3 of our water uses. The 20% of economic output or less comes from our agricultural uses, that 2/3.
Oh.
So it's striking just how much more valuable per unit of water non-agricultural uses are.
Well, you had mentioned, I guess, a couple of times so far in our conversation, infrastructure. And you talked about the water that's available for agriculture and also what's needed for the growth of the urban community. Help us, if you would, please. This all takes money. And it all takes funding. And at the same time, I can't imagine it doesn't take, the politicians to get involved. Is there the political will, and is there funding that would help us do the upgrades to meet the potential growth, and both population-wise and economically for Arizona?
It's a great question. And, this isn't unique to just water. We see this across the contemporary United States. There's a struggle to get both the money and the sort of political will or political ability to execute on big infrastructure projects recently. Even the Central Arizona Project that we talked about to bring Colorado River water in, it was both expensive and politically challenging. It took a long time to resolve all the political issues between Arizona and California and Colorado and other states. Those political issues have only gotten worse, and the cost of these infrastructure projects has only gotten more expensive since that was done in the 20th century, right? So it's much more expensive today and potentially much more politically difficult today. So I think it's an open question. We don't really have a proof of concept of can we do things like the Central Arizona Project or the Hoover Dam or even major railway or freeway projects in the United States today. I hope the answer is yes, we can. We just need to solve some of these political and regulatory issues, but I think it's an open question, to be honest with you.
Okay, I've got 3 follow-up questions, and I think all of us are wondering the same thing. First, do you have the internal water resources that you can solve your own problem and you don't have to go to an interstate pact to solve it one way or another, but do you have the internal resources to meet your needs in the future?
It's a good question, and I think the answer is it's complicated because you basically have asked 2 questions. One, do we have enough water to meet our needs, maybe from either surface water that's just our right, not a river water that's a federal right, or from groundwater that's just our right. But 2, can we use it, right? So let me tell you why that's complicated. Suppose we identify that we've got a surplus of groundwater in some rural part of Arizona, like Cibola, we talk about it in the paper, and we have a need in the Phoenix metro area in Queen Creek, like we talk about in the paper. How do you get the water? That's a groundwater, an Arizona groundwater right, potentially in rural Arizona, and a Arizona city or town that needs it. There shouldn't be a national intersection with the feds or interstate regulation or anything like that. But the challenge is how you move water. It's expensive. It's heavy stuff, right? So the way we move it is typically using canal systems and river systems. And that's where you run into these issues, because the canal systems and the river systems tend to be federally regulated or federally funded.
So you give me one example of how you could take water from one area. And in your study, you mentioned that the agricultural use isn't using all of it. In fact, your study example, which I thought was rather interesting, is you said the agriculture could be supported. The current agricultural use could be supported, even though selling much of their water rights to the community you mentioned. I thought that was fascinating, a great way to resolve things. But you talked about infrastructure costs. What are we talking about? Are we talking about something that's so expensive that it would be too much for people to own a house in Arizona because of the cost of water associated with it? Or are we talking about something that is reasonable as far as additional costs to homeowners to have the water available? Help us out.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. And this I think is another important distinction. We're used to, in Arizona, the United States, this assumption that water is cheap. And if it's not cheap, development can't occur or growth can't occur. And so the short answer to your question is, new marginal water uses are going to be more expensive than what we're used to. That's just going to be a fact of life. The value, the return, this is where I think the GDP figures that you talked about are important. The return on those new marginal uses is so high that it's perfectly feasible and reasonable to pay those higher costs. You're never going to be paying, hundreds or thousands of dollars per acre foot for desal water to grow tomatoes. That doesn't make any feasible economic sense. But could you have some small, high-tech industrial user in the city of Phoenix paying a lot of money for a little bit of that kind of water? Absolutely. So that's what we're talking about here. The average water use and the average water cost will probably always be agriculture and low. But those marginal uses, those small number of users using a relatively small amount of water, are going to be willing potentially to pay a lot more than we're used to seeing in the United States. What you need is to unlock the ability for that to happen. Right now, it's very difficult to move water because, again, as we've alluded to throughout, you need infrastructure, which is expensive, and you need the political permission to build the infrastructure and then use it.
I don't mean to put you on the hot plate, but I'm going to ask you for an estimate. And let's assume that I was spending for an average house in Maricopa County, $150, $200 a month for water. Are you talking about something that will make water available for the new resident that would have access to this water as a part of the total aggregate amount? That $200 going to $800? Are you talking about that $200 for my house going to $300? What are we talking about? And that may be a field question, but I think we'd appreciate it.
No, I think it is a fair question and a reasonable question. And the short answer is, yeah, absolutely. You're talking about multiples. So we're not talking about 10 or 20 or 30% potential increases in cost. You are talking about the potential for multiples increase in cost. 2, 3, or 4 times is not outside the realm of feasibility. But I also think it's important to remember we don't need to start necessarily with residential, right? I think the first people that will be willing to look at this and to spend the kind of money it will take to execute on this will be these high-tech manufacturing industries. Just as you're seeing talk about, alternative energy sources, small nuclear, that's going to be extremely expensive too compared to legacy energy sources, but they will be willing to spend a lot of money both for electricity and water because their value will be high. So I think that's where you'll see it first, not necessarily in a homeowner's water bill.
Okay, let's pivot to the issue of who's managing all of this. How does, can you manage what we're talking about here? Every time I look at something like this, it's a labyrinth of confusion of all the people and entities and all this. So help us how we could begin to understand it and how we could trace this to see how progress could be being made.
Yeah, we've tiptoed around this throughout. So just to really be specific on it, the answer is many, many people, many, many political entities, political jurisdictions, and that's part of the issue. Generally, water in the United States is not a private right, it's a public right. And then there's variance depending on where you are in the United States and what that means. But in practical terms, it means ultimately it's subject to federal, state, and local laws, rules, and regulations about how you can use it, when you can use it, where you can use it, etc. So in Arizona, depending on whether we're talking river water or surface water or groundwater, it varies between whether it's the federal government that regulates it first or the state government or a local community or some combination of all three. And then you often have folks who don't necessarily have any legal right to talk about how water is using, who still have a political right to talk about how water is used. You see this all the time. You see this especially with like local communities and local governments who don't necessarily have a statutory role in how groundwater is treated. That's a state role, but the state will listen to them and their feedback. So you end up with a lot of folks with legal and political rights injecting themselves in the conversation.
Well, you didn't clear anything up for me, Glenn, with regards to all the entities that are involved, but I think you can clear it up if you would. Take the example, if you would, of what you've already done. And you mentioned it earlier in Arizona with the Chipola to Queen Creek residential development. I think that'll kind of help us on how are the parties involved and how did it impact the agricultural side as well as the residential?
Yeah, no, I did find this very interesting. It's a real life example that's occurred relatively recently, which identified a need. Queen Creek is one of the fastest growing cities in the state. It's in the what I'll call the exurbs of the Phoenix metropolitan area. So it's outside of the traditional urban boundaries of the places that we all know, like Phoenix, Mesa, and Scottsdale. But growth is occurring there because that's where land is available and housing is available for cheap. But that growth needs water. Because it's so far removed from the traditional urban boundaries, it struggles to get access to sort of legacy grandfathered water rights. So it needs to seek new and alternative uses. So Queen Creek identified a property in Cibola that had far more water available to it than it was using for its agricultural purposes. And there was an opportunity there for an exchange, right? You have a bunch of water, which we want. You're not using it. There's an amount of money we can pay you to facilitate the exchange of that water. And so a deal was brokered between the property owner and the town to basically buy that water and then utilize the infrastructure we've talked about. In this case, it was the Central Arizona Project. It was going to use a combination of a natural river and the Central Arizona Project Canal to physically move that water from Cibola to Queen Creek, from far west rural Arizona to ex-urban Phoenix metro area, and then to use payment to compensate the property owner for it. Everybody should win. Everybody should come out ahead. But there was a lot of politics, a lot of concern. There was federal concern because they wanted to use the river and the canal. They needed permission from the federal government to execute on this. The federal government then turned to the state to consult with the state. Should we allow this deal to go forward? The state then turned and consulted with the local community. So there were a lot of politics. There was a lot of uncertainty over whether this would occur. There was concern that, for example, the water belonged to the community and taking it away from the community was sort of robbing it of its resources and things like that. Ultimately, the deal was able to be executed, but this was, in the grand scheme, politically difficult, fiscally expensive, and a relatively small amount of water. So it goes back to the point of how difficult this can be to accomplish at scale, and why I think most of the solutions are going to be these sort of small marginal uses.
A couple of things struck me, and make certain I've got this clear for all of us listening. You mentioned all of the various entities that were involved. The first thing is, did this take a decade? Did it take 1 year? Did it take 2 decades? How much time are we talking about?
We're talking years, not a decade.
Years, okay. And now you're saying that by this example, maybe a roadmap has been created, and is that going to help in other situations like this, or am I being overly optimistic?
No, I think that's fair. I think they've established that there's a feasibility, that there are existing markets and existing physical tools that we can use to make this work. And we've established what the political concerns are, what the community and stakeholder concerns are, and how to address and assuage those concerns, right? One of the solutions offered was to limit the amount of the transfer and to reinvest in the local community to sort of compensate them for the use of that water, right? And so those solutions provide what you call the roadmap, I think, yes.
Wait a minute, that seems like a win-win. You're telling me that I have a resource in this county, this farmland. I wasn't using all of it, but yet I still kept enough of that resource to keep my farming going on. And yet I was getting funds that I didn't have before that I could use for the development of my community if I so choose to do it.
100%. You know, it's like the oil rush of the 1900s.
Why aren't we doing more of this in Arizona?
Well, I don't know this to be true, but if I had to guess, Earl, I think people don't think of water as a commodity or a resource. We don't necessarily think about water the way we think about oil or gold. But if you're a small town and you're sitting on an oil field, that's a resource. You're not necessarily thinking, I'm going to build, some oil consuming industry here in my small town in Kansas, right? You're thinking, I'm going to drill it out, pipe it to Detroit or wherever so they can use it, but I'm going to extract value from that. Same thing here. Instead of thinking, I must use this water here, think of it as a valuable commodity that we're sitting on that we can sell to where they need it, and then that sale can inject the resources locally that we need and want.
I don't know if it's unique or not, but it sounds like an unusual solution that benefits everybody, and congratulations to Arizona for starting it. I'm not aware of other areas of the country that may have done it. You may be, but let's move on. You've pulled off what some call a miracle in the development of Arizona in this, terribly dry area. Give us a sense of this. Can the Arizona miracle continue? And what's its future growth dependent upon, and what decisions do you think have to be made for that to occur?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing is we need to change the conversation. Because of the drought and because of the overallocation of Colorado River, it's become convenient and easy to just say we're running out of water. And once you say that, there's no longer responsibility to solve the problem. If we're running out of water, that's just, we have to learn to live with less, basically. So that becomes an easy way to short circuit any progress or any conversation or any improvement. We aren't running out of water. What we're running out of is the means to use the water resources that we have, because we've stopped with the infrastructure development and the legal development to enable people to use those. So
I just want to reemphasize that. So you're saying the issue is the means, it's not the resource.
100%.
And that's just human ingenuity that has got to be exercised in Arizona.
100%. And to free up that exercise, I think you have to stop. If you convince everyone that we're running out of water, the politicians, the investors, the public, they no longer have incentive to try and address these issues. They instead try to adapt, to live with less, or to go elsewhere, neither of which we necessarily want. So change that conversation to we have a Colorado River problem, not a total water problem. And how do we solve a specific Colorado River problem? That we solve with things like transfers, new sources, and the infrastructure.
Len, I must admit, I had always considered Arizona constrained by water, and the Colorado River having some issues was going to constrain that. And for you to clarify that, hey, we have the resource, we just have to exercise the willpower and the ingenuity to get this resource to help our state continue to grow, is just enlightening. I very much appreciate it. Arizona has proven that growth in the desert is possible. And boy, your study sure did do that. But you also have been very candid that, the result isn't guaranteed because you've got so many parties that are involved. And I guess the one that always concerns me a little bit, doesn't matter who's in office, happens to be the political side. But you've also pointed out that it goes down to the local community. So it's just not at the State House. It's also that you have to have people at the local level being aware of the opportunity and how this can be, as you've already presented, a win-win for everybody. This study, I encourage anybody and everybody, because the history you put together in the study, I think any Arizona would like to know that history and be well informed. And if there's people that are in this podcast that want to know more about what's going on and have questions, please contact us through Common Sense Institute. I know Glenn would be glad to respond, and he always does. But before we end this episode, I wanted to share that the Common Sense Digest, and I don't mean to be, kind of blowing our own horn here, but we have been listed in the top 100 podcasts in Colorado by FeedSpot. Now, I don't really know what that means other than maybe we're one of 100. But the point is, thank you for all of our listeners and guests for making this possible. As always, I'm Earl Wright. This is another successful episode of Common Sense Digest. Welcome to Glenn. Thank you to Glenn Farley, because Glenn, you make it happen, my friend, with all of your studies and thorough analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Earl.
Thank you for listening to the Common Sense Digest. For more on today's topic, as well as our research on the most pressing public policy issues facing Arizona, please visit commonsenseinstituteaz.org. The preceding episode, along with all others, is available on podcatchers everywhere or on our website under the podcast tab. Our technical producer is John Ekstrom and Deft Communications. This has been a production of the Common Sense Institute.